It is Friday, boys and gals, and it's TLF for tanks.
In the raid.
The raid, yes.
So sorry, I went in there.
Nah, man, because we haven't done a tanks in the raid since like forever. This is like the first time we do it.
I think it was
for Dragonflight.
Shadowlands.
Yeah, it was Shadowlands. I don't know, some 9.2 something over there. It's been a long time, and since like the race 12 first has ended, everybody's like still progressing. Like your average Joe is progressing either heroic or dabbling into mythic and stuff. It's all proper time to get into the performance and the rankings on tanks. We're gonna have a look at, you know, the damage intake, the damage performance, I would say, for them, because, you know, it is important for tanks to deal some damage, especially on a couple of fights, but it's really much more important, I would say, the amount they can mitigate.
Oh yeah, that's
right?
And it depends on the tanks, obviously, because certain tanks don't need to mitigate as much because they have better self-sustain, blood decay, and obviously a lot of tanks' performance, if you want to look at the logs and see which tanks clear the most amount of bosses, depends also on the guild and on the group, so we tried to take a more balanced approach than what everybody's doing at the moment on this particular day and age. And we're gonna also have a kind of a summary at the end of the video talking about, you know, what could the meta shape up look like and what you could have to look at if you saw from a different perspective.
All right, shut up, man. Let's talk about Blood Death Knight. Blood Death Knight, who I believe has been one of the more stronger, or I would say more present tanks within the raid. I know. Why are you laughing?
No, it's a good tank.
Why are you laughing?
We have a blood decay and it's healing more than me. And
I know, man. I was getting to that. So in our guild, our blood decay, when we're looking at the healing meters, obviously Flame, playing his Invoker, there's the top, and everything is top. But when Flame is not there, it's like the blood decay heal just outshines every healer, no problem.
It's pretty nutty.
I mean, what can that translate into? I mean, obviously, blood decay. I mean, I think in terms of like the damage, it takes a lot more than I would say warrior.
Well,
warrior.
It should take probably the most amount of damage out of everybody.
Yeah, I mean the self heals are ridiculous, man, and I don't know if it's like intended this way or are people talking about being a little bit too much.
I think it's well, I've looked at some of the logs and I think it's a byproduct of the what is it, 40% extra HP buff that we got or however.
Yeah, could be.
And that actually helps blood decay because the main issue that you would have had with the blood decay, especially on progress type content where you're like pushing above your pay grade a little bit, is that you risk being one shot, and that's not what you want to do, because if you don't get one shot, you heal for pretty much all the damage that you take. And seeing as how everybody now has a bigger HP pool, that obviously puts blood above pretty much everybody else, maybe at the same level as Brew.
Let's just put it into the top of the A tier here. Very strong tank for the raid. You see it everywhere, and by no surprise. Now, let's talk about the Brewmaster Monk. I mean, if you want to deal damage, I would say Brewmaster is the tank to go. Have we played with I don't think we had any.
We haven't played with the
Brewmaster,
but we did look at some of the top Brewmasters on specific fights, and they were pulling the highest numbers that we've been able to see at this point in time. So Brewmaster, and we kind of knew this going into Dragonflight, that Brew had the most amount of damage potential out of all the tanks, which is, you know, the drawback to compensate for the drawback of, you know, being one of the squishiest. Although
I mean, the self-sustain is pretty decent.
It's okay.
I think there's a problem, like if you're going to talk about like super low, not low, but talking about normal raids or people that are actually just going through it to really far, a lot of healers or teams don't really understand how the stagger mechanic works, and some people just feel like, oh my god, this tank sucks.
It was also a problem with the HP, and what most group players seem to have ran into is the fact that their self-sustain is not as big as before. It's okay, it's, you know, it's not the best, and it doesn't really scale with the amount of damage taken, so I still feel like Brew is probably taking a little bit more damage than they can actually solve themselves, so they're a little bit more reliant on a healer, whereas a blood decay can take more damage than a Brew, but can heal, I don't know, double or triple the amount.
I would just say, like, okay, for the sake of the argument, a blood decay has, like, you know, mediocre damage, I would say, not ignorable, but it cannot really compare to like Brewmaster. So Brewmaster's damage will just pump it up into A tier as well. I think these are like the two tanks that can be seen like for the majority of the comps or whatever, because one can deal very good with its self-healing and self-sustain, then the other can do really high amounts of damage. So there you go. All right, let's talk about the bear. What a trip this has been with Guardian Druids. Oh my god. I mean, we cannot say that is like it's total shit. It's not about
It's
that.
progressing through Mythic at the very least. It has some of the bosses cleared, at least some of the bears that are actually logging, because we don't know if there are people that are clearing higher and not logging with their bear.
Yeah.
But as far as we've been able to observe, the bears are behind everybody, but they are still clearing. Bear is kind of like slightly below average. Right now, I think bear is about C tier. Its self-sustain is actually abysmal. It's probably the worst self-sustain out of all of the tanks in terms of like raw numbers, although, you know, this can always fluctuate depending on the person, depending on the raid, depending on the group, depending on, you know, if your bear is doing ads on Diurna or if it's doing the boss or whatever, because that's kind of where the progress is at the moment for the general people. They haven't actually gotten cutting edge yet from what we've seen. So that's kind of where bear is, and that's a little bit of a shame. I think if any tank deserves a buff, it would probably be bear.
Yeah, and it has like, you know, pretty low self-sustain, and the mitigation is not that great either. It's kind of like mediocre. So I would say like above average type wrecking, it's still good. This doesn't mean that, you know, you don't see bears progressing into mythic. No, you see them there, but they kind of like pale to comparison in like when you look at blood decays and brewmasters and stuff. So we'll see if things change with more patches coming very, very soon.
Yep.
Now let's talk about prot paladins, baby.
The paladins.
And I would say that was like when we were kind of expecting, you know, not too many good things about prot paladin just because of the design. There was a lot of issues with the designs. This doesn't mean a similar argument for red paladin. It's like, okay, the talents can be designed pretty bad or nasty, don't make sense, but that doesn't mean they can have the performance they need, right?
We talked with the guys in our podcast about Prot Paladin about this as well. The design is a little bit weird, but the numbers are strangely there. However, I mean, what actually surprised me with Prot Paladin is the amount of damage that can actually mitigate, which, I mean, it shouldn't probably be surprising. It should be, you know, like
they have a lot of tools for
up there with Warrior in terms of like, in terms of like design. You have a shield, you have armor, you have block, you kind of want to, you know, not take a lot of damage. However, from what I've been, and this is obviously probably skewed by the logs that we've been able to look at, the self-sustain is not as high as I remember it being in Shadowlands. So I think that took a little bit of a dip, and the damage also took a little bit of a dip as to what we remembered. Because in Shadowlands, for the last 2 patches, I think
it was the top
the best tank in terms of damage.
In terms of like tanks, I think it's mostly due to like the numbers. Like you cannot really like rely too much nowadays on World of Glory. Everything got kind of gimped. This is like the story of the Paladin in a nutshell for all the specs. Everything kind of got gimped. So what was like cool or reliant in the past is a little bit gimped now. It's not shit.
You don't have as much holy power as before, because
that's also a big
but
thing.
World of Glories, you can get, you know, the free World of Glory a little bit more often, but it's just it's different. It's okay.
I would dare to say that the damage is still pretty good.
It's better.
It's better for sure. So I would see it in a B tier.
Yeah.
You could put it into A, but then you have to like compare it to Blood Decay and Brewmaster, which, dude,
no, like both of them, whatever weaknesses and strengths Prot Paladin shares with A tier does all of those better than Prot Paladin.
All right, but are you ready to talk about our Lord and Savior Protection Warrior?
Dude,
man, I cannot believe you did not make Protection Warrior.
Dude, I was actually talking with our main tank, who's actually maining Protection right now. The tables have flipped since Shadowlands, like drastically. Protection Warrior is probably one of the easier tanks to play now, if not the easiest. Is one of the one that punishes you the least.
Really?
Out of all of them, yeah. It's stupid tanky. You have to sacrifice almost nothing for tankiness compared to other tanks. And it's doing high damage. It's not Brewmaster level damage, but I think it's probably second in terms of damage output. It's way up there. But the thing is, Pro Warrior has close to no weaknesses.
Yeah, this is, it's almost like, it kind of reminds me like in the good old days of Prot Paladin, to be honest, because there was a time where Prot Paladins had so many things, it was very, very hard to like find a super like clear weakness. I think like Prot Warrior has probably the highest upfront damage mitigation out of all of the tanks.
For sure.
I mean,
kind of always had it, but now they have no K or self-sustain.
Yeah, and there's no competition in terms to that. I mean, sure, you can talk about, you know, Blood Decay selling through the roof or whatever, or, you know, staggering damage from Brewmasters or whatnot, but I think like, and also like the damage they deal, I would say pretty good, man. I would say it's pretty good. And I know there was an issue at some point with Prot Warriors, I think, but this was before 9.2 and the double leg was and all of that. in raid specifically, not talking about AoE, although the raid is kind of cleaving for the most part.
It was probably the main issue that it shared was probably with Brewmaster, where the magic damage intake was a problem.
The magic damage.
The HP pools are bigger now. You have spell reflect on a bigger cooldown. You have spell block if you really need to. Although Ignore Pain has been nerfed, you do feel like you have a few more other sources of self-sustain. However, the self-sustain for Pro Warrior is nothing like amazing. It's okay, it's good, but it's kind of like average, right? It cannot compare to like Brew or Blood, but it doesn't really feel like you need self-sustain. The thing is, with other tanks, when your HP drops, you're like, okay, what's going on? I need some help. With Pro Warrior, it's like, oh, shield wall, whatever.
And it's a fine and more relaxing time for healers. But that being said, all of this concludes to the fact that Prot Warrior,
to nobody's surprise,
no surprise here, it's the S tier tank. I mean, we talked about this during the alpha and beta. It was to come.
The thing is, in terms of like performance, it's not super far ahead of everybody else, and we will talk about more on that at the end of the video. But we have, if there's one spec that's gonna be S tier, it has to be Pro Warrior.
For sure. Okay, we have one more tank to talk about, and that is Vengeance Demon Hunter, a very respectable spec nevertheless. Again, another high damage dealing tank. This is like, is this the right phrasing? High damage dealing tank?
It's kind of like with Warrior, maybe a little bit lower than Warrior, kind of like in terms of the logs, right? But it also depends on what kind of build you have for Vengeance. Obviously, you can focus more on AoE or single target, but what's good about it, high damage or not, is that raid damage for Vengeance, period, was terrible in the last raid tier. Obviously, with Shadowlands, we went through like a couple of talent rework, things change. To be fair, I kind of expect the Vengeance to be a little bit higher, maybe definitely instead of Brew or Blood.
But it's weird now because a lot of like guilds are still progressing, so we don't know for sure how things are going to look once we get like most of the guilds getting to cutting edge, because that's when the dust settles and you're going to see a lot of, also that paired up with a lot of like tweaks that Blizzard will do, but it's still a very respectable, I would say, B tier. I think it's better than Prot Paladin.
It's probably a little bit better. It seems to be doing well, it has more parses than Prot on Mythic, so we can only assume that more people are playing and getting good results with it. Although that's not indicative of it being better than Prot just on its own, but it does seem to do a little bit more damage, it does seem to do a little bit more healing, and if we expect that, probably the main reason why more people don't play Vengeance is because Havoc is so good. So if you're gonna, use the utilities like we want our raid to be as diverse as possible, you probably will go for a Havoc before a Vengeance. However, when you do go for a Vengeance, it probably has some more utility than I would say a Prot Paladin. Obviously, the brand is really good, but also the fact that you're super mobile, considering like how many mechanics have to see tanks move around a lot. Yeah, that can definitely help.
One big argument for Vengeance as well. But this is like the picture so far up until this point of progression on everybody who actually uses the logs and make them publicly. It's kind of like a no-brainer for the most part. I mean, Protection Warrior is no surprise over here. We can talk about now. So this is like our ranking, okay? We can talk about now, just we put it on the screen. The rankings based on progression?
Yeah, on actual bosses cleared. So it's a little bit weird to look at and to establish a ranking for specs when, not everybody has their full gear set, and everybody's basically picking specs on a skewed perception based on, race world first or whatever it thinks is good, because obviously weaker specs can do worse, can do good as well, I mean, and you don't need the 1%, but if you really want to make the most out of it, to push as highest, then you can go for like a Blood Decay and a Prot, because at the time of this recording, when we looked at the logs, people haven't cleared Razageth yet, but on Diurna, I think there's like almost an even split between Prot Warriors and Blood Decay.
Yeah. This is the thing, you're gonna see like, so there's not many changes happening over here, it's just that Brewmaster retains his position on A tier, like this is purely out of like progression at this point.
There's one Brewmaster among the sea of Pro Warriors, and that's the only tank that's kind of like keeping it up, but there's like only one person, so I don't know exactly if it's warranted to be S tier, but I'd say, okay, it's better than the rest.
Yeah. But you see, like, the tons of Prot Warriors and Blood Decays, no surprise. Other than that, we retain, Vengeance and Prot Paladins for B tier. And sadly, the bear, who I was rooting for, is still a C tier. It's not shit, okay? It's just like
it's just a couple of bosses behind, which means a little bit in terms of mythic progression, which is why it's a couple of tiers below. But by no means, once you get like decent amount of gear or progressing a little bit, you cannot kill Razageth with bear.
Yep. But hey, let us know what you think. What tank do you play in your mythic progression or heroic progression. How is it going? How is like your partner tank doing? What do you feel about this whole ranking situation? Because this will probably change again in a month from now. We're gonna have, you know, everybody doing their CEs and whatever, and then the tunings, and then bear buffs. Hopefully, we're gonna have to see it. You also have to see our Patreons, because you know they support everything that we do around here. Patreon.com/Marcelian_online. If you want to support the team, just click that link, check the tiers. There's a bunch of goodies there. You're gonna support the content. That's the most important thing. But there's also things to get by over there, like wallpapers with your character and stuff like that. Bloopers and Patreon talks, which we have to do next week, I guess. Well, talking about
it's coming soon. The Patreon talk is coming soon for everybody who is still in our Patreon group. And we will talk more details about 2023 at Marcelian&Flame.
Yeah, content and stuff. And thank you for watching the video up until this point. Have a great year. Have a 2023 that will be magical and happiness, peace in the world, and
with cheap electrical bills.
Bye!
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.